Hello everyone, we are from COVID. COVID is a one-stop resource that aims to educate the general public about the available legislation and remedies with regards to COVID-19. I'm Chloe.
And I'm Anthea, and today we have the honor of interviewing legal medical practitioner Ms. Kuah Boon Theng. Good afternoon, Ms. Kuah. Thank you for joining us with this interview.
Thank you, Anthea, and thank you for inviting me to this interview.
So maybe we could start off with the first question. So could you tell us more about yourself and the work you do in the field of medical law and ethics?
My area of practice is in medical law. I think one common misconception of the work that I do is that it is purely or predominantly medical legal in terms of malpractice cases and disciplinary cases. But because I advise quite a lot of the healthcare institutions in Singapore, the hospitals, the scope of my work is actually a little bit wider than that. I do have to advise hospitals on some of the regulatory requirements that they have to comply with. And I also try to give my input in terms of risk management. So I think my team and I pride ourselves on the fact that we don't just look at each case as it comes in, but we are always trying to look out for any areas where the practice can be improved, and we will give our feedback to the hospitals to see if they can fine-tune their operations to reduce certain risks that may arise in the course of their delivery of healthcare to their patients. Okay.
So how do you think COVID-19 has changed the client-lawyer interaction, and how have you adapted to it?
Right. Okay. So I guess my firm's quite fortunate, I would say. It's, for quite some time now, we mainly communicate with our clients through emails. Yes, sometimes we have meetings, but we try to be efficient and do everything in the quickest way possible. Bearing in mind that very often the people that we have to discuss cases with are busy healthcare professionals. So we try not to take them away from their, patient care. And so that's the reason why we have been communicating largely through emails. So I think when COVID hit, and particularly when circuit breaker, was implemented, it didn't take us long to put in some additional measures so that all of my colleagues and I could work from home without too much disruption. Okay, so a lot of the documents that we deal with are already in soft copy, and of course we have to make sure they're secure, but we are able to work based on the documents that we send back and forth via email. So I guess we've been fortunate in that respect. Of course, a large part of what we do is we have to interact sometimes with clients, or actually we have to talk to complainants. Okay, sometimes a complainant may want an opportunity to talk to their doctors, and we are involved, the lawyers will be involved to facilitate that communication process. And in the early days, of course, the only option was to do it by Zoom. And there was always some concern as to whether the information exchange would be the same via Zoom as compared to in person. Okay, but we found that it hasn't been as bad as we thought, and we've had good exchanges via Zoom. I think everybody has learned to adapt to the new norm. And I think that some of these changes will probably be here to stay. Yeah, because it does make us a little bit more efficient. It cuts down time in traveling and taking people away from their work. So I think people have just gotten used to it over time.
So how do you think the work you do, like under medical law, will see changes due to the pandemic? And as you said just now, you said that some changes are likely to stay. So what do you think is most likely to stay, and what are some things that you hope can return to what it was previously?
Okay. So casting my mind on the challenges that have been faced by my clients because of COVID, of course, one big issue has been the fact that they've had to really rethink their deployment of resources. A lot of our doctors have been working on split teams, especially at the height of the circuit breaker. and it's meant that patients who may normally see a certain doctor have had to be assigned to be seen by somebody else. And so that's been an adjustment. And also, there has been increased use of telemedicine in one form or another. Okay, so some of the less urgent consultations, patients were given an option to actually have their consults via video conference with their doctors. And of course, that's not for all cases, but these are for cases where patients have largely have stable disease. Okay, and it's better than them not being able to see their doctors at all. And of course, doctors have had to get used to the limitations of not being able to physically examine their patients. It has meant that they've had to pay particular attention to how to communicate with their patients via such medium, making sure they get proper information. And sometimes they even try to see if they can look at their patients via the camera, but I think it's a time where the healthcare industry has had to be resourceful just to cope with this challenge. And I think that they have done fairly well, I would say. Okay, and hopefully, as things have the restrictions have been eased, things have slowly gone back to normal. But I think that there are some things that might become a little bit more entrenched in terms of their moving forward, how they interact with the patients. So I think the idea that patients might be given self-monitoring devices to record certain information, and that's automatically fed back to the hospital who checks the data, that sort of healthcare monitoring. I think what COVID has taught us is that we need to increase our capability to do that well moving forward. Okay, to maybe that could be a good strategy to look after some of the chronic diseases that the doctors are managing. But of course, the challenge is in making sure that you select the right cases. What we don't want to see is that patients who really do need to come into the hospital to see their doctors and to be properly examined, they don't do that thinking that it's enough that they are remotely monitored. And we don't want situations where they come in and there's a complication, or and it's already late, okay, to intervene.
Just like you previously mentioned, how there's increased use of telemedicine, how doctors have been selective in their cases as to which they want to examine and which they want to just use telemedicine. So I was wondering whether there's any new additional challenges that give rise to new legal problems. For example, perhaps under the law of negligence, where some doctors maybe misjudge the situation and it's more severe than it really is, but they dismiss it and they only perhaps see the patient through telemedicine.
Well, I'll be honest with you. I think that this whole area of medical advice has, in the last couple of years, been the biggest challenge in terms of medical legal risk. Okay, the spate of cases or the incidence of complaints relating to what information a patient receives from your doctors, this is the fastest growing area, in terms of complaints and medical legal risk. I think. When you talk about being able to triage the risk, who comes into the hospital, who can be dealt with via telemedicine and other remote monitoring means, it's also dependent on the information that the patient provides. Okay, so like I said, very often it's a question of whether you think that this patient has stable disease, but that is really also based on what the patient tells people who call. How are you? Have you been having symptoms? And so on. So I think we need to have a larger conversation about how to improve the communications between healthcare providers and their patients. We've talked a lot about helping doctors be more effective in their communications, right? But we don't really say enough about how to help patients, okay, communicate more effectively with their doctors. The concern is always that patients, because they have less information and knowledge, certain things it may not occur to them, okay, to mention or to report, okay, and it turns out it could be clinically significant. Is that something we can really blame the healthcare providers? well, because, they are going to say, well, we were not even aware that you had these additional issues, but the patient didn't, form the link, okay, to realize this is something that I need to tell the hospital and the doctor who calls me up. So I think that we need to really think about, improving basic health education to the patient population, and also teaching them how to communicate with their doctors, how to ask questions. Some patients will ask a lot of things, many of which may not even be relevant. But then you have a very big percentage of patient population who are very awed by their doctors and who don't dare to ask. Okay, they actually don't understand. They're shy to say. And we need to have also patient education, teach them to be comfortable talking to their doctors. And we also need to teach doctors to put their patients at ease, because sometimes they can come across as being very stern, very very technical in the way they speak. So I think this is something that we really need to have another. We need to have serious conversations about how we can do that better moving forward.
Yes, I think those are very serious considerations we need to take in mind as well. But other than those considerations, from a legal perspective, why do you think Singapore has managed to manage this pandemic so well compared to other countries?
Okay. Well, I think no country's response has been perfect. So I'll say that first, because I don't want it to be said that I'm necessarily saying that we've done well in all areas. Okay. But I think people will also realize that we've taken quite decisive action to improve things and to trace and track and so on. And that's largely because we have quite a comprehensive set of legislative provisions under the Infectious Disease Act. A lot of people don't realize that we have very comprehensive legislation in this area that allows us to take a lot of action to protect the public, okay, in the interest of public safety. Of course, some countries may feel that it's, we set aside a lot of individual rights, like, oh, it's my right not to do this, or why should I have to restrict my movements and all that. But I think in Singapore, as a Asian country, by and large, we are prepared to acknowledge that each of us have to do our part, okay, and give out some of our individual rights for the sake of the public good, okay. And what's happened is, with Infectious Disease Act, every time we have a pandemic, and we have had experience managing this, from SARS, from MERS, and so on, and swine flu, H1N1. Every time we go through this, we are always learning, okay, how we can adapt our regulations better to cope with the specific problems that we are encountering. And a lot of people may not know that throughout the course of COVID-19, there are many regulations that are being issued, often on a daily basis, okay, to tell doctors, hospitals, how to adjust their operations and implement additional measures to cope with the cases that they see. Things like, when do you do a COVID test? Okay, there has to be consistency in the approach, and everything is overseen by the ministry, and they issue out all these directives so that everyone is on the same page in terms of what needs to be done. Okay, and I think also we've learned from the lessons of the previous outbreaks. So we had a lot of knowledge and know-how already on how to do the safe entry, contact tracing. We have learned and built on our capabilities, and I think that has served us well in terms of how we've tackled the pandemic in Singapore.
COVID-19 is frequently compared to SARS because SARS is one of the biggest outbreaks our country has ever gone through prior to COVID-19. So what do you think are some lessons learned from SARS that's allowed Singapore to better handle and tackle this virus?
I feel really old now because, yeah, it's before you can remember, but unfortunately, we were all in the thick of it when it happened, when SARS happened. I think SARS was quite a turning point. We've had to deal with outbreaks before, okay, but SARS extracted a very heavy toll because you know, you might recall or you might have heard that we lost some of our healthcare professionals to the disease, okay, and because of how how virulent it was, how high the fatality rate was if you were to contract it. It was really a sobering moment, for the healthcare profession to deal with. So I think at that point in time, as far as I can remember, that was the time when people got used to having to register when they go to a hospital, when they go somewhere, to visit somebody, and they all had to queue up and give their IC for registration. That was the first time I recall that we all had to get used to that. Okay, getting used to the fact that it's important to leave a trace of where you are, so that if anything happens, you can be contacted quickly, and they can isolate you, and you can protect other people if you have been potentially exposed. So that was a very important start, okay, to get everyone used to the idea that all of this was necessary. And when we saw the fatalities, we saw the people who died because of SARS, and I think that there really was no hesitation, on the part of many people, say that yes, it is necessary that we do this, okay, in order to safeguard lives. And what I think COVID has just brought it to the next level, because prior to that, we were concerned at the spread of the disease in certain locations, but COVID is everywhere. And I think it's just meant that a lot of the measures that we learned were useful, has had to be implemented on a very grand scale, okay, just to make sure that community cases are caught, are brought down, and also are quickly traced, and we could protect everybody. Okay, and of course now, because it is a global issue, with SARS, we knew that there were certain countries that are more affected than others, and it didn't hit the world on the kind of scale that we see with COVID. Okay, so now with the fact that the whole world is in the grips of this pandemic, we've also had additional challenges in terms of cutting the travel links, and controlling access, and dealing with imported cases, making sure that they're quarantined quickly when they come in, tested before they're allowed to mingle with the community. So these are additional things, and I think that every time this happens, we've had to learn, okay, new measures to be able to protect the public from on all quarters, on all fronts.
Mention how SARS and COVID-19 is on like a completely different scale for us in Singapore. So what do you think are some medical and ethical implications maybe of reporting patients who maybe have flouted the circuit breaker laws that doctors have since realized?
Yeah. I don't know. You let me know if you think that people generally have an issue with this. I think that Singaporeans are intelligent, and they understand that we all have to behave responsibly, okay, and we have to be honest about our whereabouts, okay, if we are to protect everyone. So I think that every time we see something reported, or somebody has failed to keep with the regulations, and they have put others at risk, I actually think most people actually become quite indignant and say, yeah, how can they be so irresponsible? Why is this person being so lackadaisical about it, where all of us are trying to be good, and all of us are putting up with the inconvenience of keeping to the law? So I think that there has been general acceptance on the necessity for all these measures. Some people may think, sometimes it's a bit draconian, but I think that sometimes it's better to be safe rather than sorry. And as we learn more about the disease, it's only right that sometimes we will try to be as safe as possible. And then once we learn a little bit more, if there is the opportunity to relax those measures, then that can be implemented gradually. But I think that this thing about ethical, okay, I think most people accept that I have to respect your confidentiality, but there must be some limits to it. Okay, so if I may not want to report you, but if what you've done or you flouted the rules is actually going to put other people at risk, the law does say that this needs to be reported and action needs so that action can be taken. And I think that most people understand that those are acceptable exceptions to confidentiality, and the general ethical duty of doctors and healthcare providers to respect their patients' healthcare information.
Mm. So even if doctors who have to abide by like patient ethics, they still have to report their patients if they find out that they flouted the circuit breaker rules. Oh, okay, interesting. So how about because just now you're talking about SARS and how now COVID is a different scale altogether and also affected a very big vulnerable group in our community, like the migrant workers. So how do you think us as a community can do to better protect these migrant workers to avoid such situations from happening in the future?
Well, okay, I think that the situation with the migrant workers, I don't pretend to be an expert in understanding the challenges of managing the risk in the dorms. I think that's a very difficult problem, and there are many elements that as a medical legal lawyer, I don't pretend to have all the answers. I do want to say though that a lot of our healthcare professionals have really stepped up, okay, to help in the dorms. This is something that you may have read about in the papers, but I can assure you that the scale of the effort and the commitment shown by our healthcare professionals, we really can't applaud them enough. A lot of them have worked tirelessly, okay, and put themselves at risk, particularly in the early days where there was so much fear over whether healthcare professionals could catch the disease when they look after patients. But a lot of them answered the call, went down to the dorms, worked for hours on end, on top of their own duties, okay, just to look after the migrant workers. And I think we owe a debt of gratitude to our healthcare heroes, okay, for everything they've done to keep us safe in the community, in the dorms, and in the hospitals.
Sure, and I think COVID-19 has affected not only the migrant workers, but a lot of people at home and impacted our daily lives. So how do you think COVID-19 has impacted the general public health, mental health throughout working from home and having to adapt to all these different changes?
Well, I'm hearing increasingly that there are a lot of effects, and I think the early days we were so focused on the physical risk, we didn't really think much about the impact on mental health. But this has been a very isolating time. Okay? A lot of people, have been cooped up at home. Not everybody has a comfortable home environment, to work from, and they've had to cope with challenges like having their children home, and trying to focus on work and homeschooling their children. It's been very challenging. And in every profession, I hear of cases where people, fall into depression. They have so much uncertainty because of the perhaps their jobs are under threat. People worried about the security of their jobs, and have had to face retrenchment or reduced work hours. It is really a frightening time for many people. They've got to worry about their health. They've got to worry about their income. They've got to worry about managing all the challenges that they have to manage at home. I do think we can't do enough, okay, to focus on this and help people. But I think that it's really up to each of us to be a friend to those around us, right? And remember those who might be struggling. Reach out to your friends. I mean, personally, I have a group of friends, lawyer friends actually. When the circuit breaker started, we made it a point to see each other on Zoom once a week just to have lunch, and we would just show each other what our tapao lunch was, and then we would just talk about things. And that really helped a great deal. But it means that you've got to make the effort. Okay, you've got to make the effort to reach out, to have somebody to have a voice to talk to. People who understand what you're going through. And I know that's not always possible if you're really feeling very down and very worried. Sometimes the last thing you want to do is to go and talk to someone and share your problems. Okay, so it is important for each of us to be conscious about those around us. Always keep our friends and our family in our minds, and reach out to them on a regular basis.
Yeah, I agree. When the circuit breaker first happened, sometimes it felt really isolating because you're cooped
In
up,
school
and then
also,
there's no
right?
distinction between, yeah, there's no distinction between work and play. So you're all still living in like the same
Yeah,
house, but you have to do everything in it, and then it gets really
correct.
isolating.
There's no start time
Yeah,
and end time to work, right? You're
yeah.
constantly,
The distinction is totally blurred now, especially when you don't travel. Yeah,
correct. So that can be tough. I'm also very conscious of the fact that not all my staff have as much room at home, and maybe sharing a computer with a family member. Not everybody has their own resources and facilities to work comfortably at home. So yeah, we have to be mindful of how other people are coping. Even if we are doing okay, I think we still need to think about those around us and make sure that everyone around us is fine.
yeah. I think another issue that also comes out like related to mental health, but not really just from working from home, but also people who have been retrenched because of
Yes,
COVID-19.
yes.
So how do you, how maybe you could like briefly share how the law has like helped them or protected them, or like the grants that they are given,
I think the
if
grants have
you
been
are aware
great.
of few of
It's been
those.
as a as an employer, because I have my own practice. I can tell you that it has been great that the government has supported us as much as they have. It's taken the weight and the stress off a lot of businesses. Of course, we know that that can't last forever, but it's given us time,
Mm.
to reassess our operations and try to be more efficient and try to be able to carry on the work, with minimal disruptions. I know that there are some industries that it's just the very nature of the work is harder. Okay, harder for you to bounce back from the fact that businesses have been literally shut or have had very little activity, very little turnover, and I think the government is doing what it can to provide all the help. Um, so there will still be those who will face difficult times. I just want to say it's not just those who actually face retrenchment. I know that among younger lawyers, okay, because I do mentor some of the younger lawyers, I know that those who perhaps had wanted to change their jobs, okay, and move on and develop their careers in other areas. It's been a very tough time to do that because right now very few firms are hiring. Okay, a lot of opportunities that younger lawyers may have thought could be available to them, they've seen those doors shut, and that has been also quite tough, okay, to accept. And some of them feel they are stagnating in their current positions, and they if they're unhappy with their current job, there's really no means to move on to a different opportunity. So that has also been very stressful to particularly to younger members of the profession.
Talked about a lot about mentoring. So how do you think that has changed for you now that everything's online? Maybe there's the lack of that physical element.
Well, truthfully, mentoring doesn't mean that you have to meet up. In fact, I think if you are only mentoring someone, if you have time to meet up, you're probably not doing your job very well. Okay? To be a mentor, you have to make yourself accessible. You have to reply to emails, calls for help, check your WhatsApp messages. And some of it is formal mentorship, some of it is not. It's really just being a friend, lending listening ear if somebody has a problem. So I think I don't think the inability to to meet up physically is an impediment to be a good mentor. I think what's more important is that we set aside time. And you know what really makes a difference is if you take the initiative to check on people, how they're doing. Okay, because I think that for somebody who is in a funk, who is down, that can be very uplifting if we take the trouble to let people know they are in our thoughts. All right, and I think that's why all of us can be mentors.
We're not really talking about this anymore, but I think I have one question that I suddenly thought of previously with reference to COVID-19 specifically with regards to those active tracing and tracking. So if I recall correctly, like previously there were regrettably some deaths arising from COVID-19. And then because of that, I think the government had to sort of like disclose, or at least in the news, they share about how these patients had like previous complications or like illnesses that they previously had. Like let's say like this patient passed away because she or he had a pre-existing condition that complicated the effects of the virus and causing him or her to pass away. So I was wondering whether there's any like ethical or like legal implications of sharing such information and why that is okay or allowed.
Sure. I think if you look at the Infectious Disease Act, there are some permitted purposes, okay, for where you can share information. Not just in the Infectious Disease Act, even if you were to look at the PDPA, okay, there are always exceptions. And I think in this instance, it was important for the authorities to be able to contextualize the COVID deaths so that the population understood what the risk factors were. Okay, it's not just to reassure those that don't have these comorbidities that, oh, you'll be fine, but it's also to alert those who have the same chronic diseases that they need to be, to be particularly careful about, taking care of themselves and not being exposed, to COVID. Okay. So I think that the government needed to release that information because they felt that it was necessary to do so. I don't really have an issue with that. Of course, if you and I happen to chance on that information, it doesn't mean that we have the right to disclose that information because just out of curiosity, just to gossip, just to share. Part of my job is I do get access to a lot of confidential information because of the very nature of the type of cases that I do. And my team knows that we are very strict, and none of the information that we receive it can be discussed outside of the workplace, and we're quite strict about that because we understand that this is all sensitive information. Okay, if you're going to talk about it, there need to be a legitimate purpose permitted under the law.
It's much of an issue with patients being dishonest about their symptoms or other like whereabouts or lying about maybe health history to healthcare staff as well.
Yeah. Well, I mean that happens. That can happen. Of course, if somebody conceals information from their healthcare provider, number one, it could compromise their own care. Okay. But also it could put others at risk, right? I think by and large, during the pandemic, our healthcare professionals have been successful in guarding themselves against contracting the virus simply because they treat everyone as potentially having it. Okay, so even if a patient says, "Oh, I didn't do this, I didn't, I wasn't exposed, I did," and so on. The healthcare providers who attend to them are still usually will take a lot of precautions. But I think patients do need to be upfront about where they've been, whether they have been exposed to certain people, whether they have a family member who has returned from abroad and who's serving, say, a stay-home notice, at home, because there was a period of time where you were allowed to do your SHN at home, and they need to be able to tell their doctors. Okay, and if they don't, then if they found out that they hide the information, then that could potentially compromise their own care and also put others at risk.
So in light of COVID-19, like based on all the different issues and like how many like different sets of like different problems that we encounter, like as a legal professional or someone focused on medical law, how do you think or how do you hope that the law will be reformed or can better help those affected by COVID-19?
Oh, that's a tough question because it could be anything, right? I mean, in terms of healthcare, I actually think that we were quite ready, okay, to deal with the challenges of this pandemic because all the necessary tools was already available to the regulatory authorities, for them to implement all the measures that we have. Okay. In terms of whether our laws, I'm sure you all know, Parliament had to sit urgently and pass certain legislation just to be able to provide temporary relief from people who were not able to fulfill the contracts because of the pandemic. And so on, and I think they've done the best that they can. I think what this has taught us is that we should never assume that we know everything and we have everything we need. But if necessary, if there's a need to get for Parliament to act very swiftly, we know that they can, and we know that they have in this instance. And that should stand us in good stead moving forward if we face any other challenges.
I think that Singapore has responded very well to this pandemic. Thank you so much for your time, Ms. Kuah. I think that's all the questions we have for you today.
You're very welcome. And thank you very much for spending your time to talk to me and giving me an opportunity to also share a little bit about what I do, and why healthcare is more important than ever, and the specific challenges that we face, and that our healthcare professionals shouldn't be taken for granted because they help us in so many ways, particularly in a crisis like this.
Yes, indeed. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay.